Well, in your book, Breaking the Spell, Dan makes, I think, a very useful, you may say, rule of fairness. He's talking about atheism, he's talking about religion, and he basically says this. He says every time somebody accuses a religious dictator of doing something bad, all the Christians basically say, oh, but it wasn't me, it wasn't Christ, he didn't teach that, and so on. To which Dan has the following answer, which I think is worth taking seriously. He says, wait a minute. He goes, religion has got to take responsibility for the crimes committed in its name. I cite this in my book. He says if someone kills in the name of Allah, Islam's going to have to take a bit of responsibility for that. If Hamas or Hezbollah does it, you can't just say, well, they weren't being true Muslims. They think they were. And I agree with Dan's principle. But then I notice that when it comes to atheism, he tries to dodge it. Because if it is true that the ordinary, mild-mannered Christian has got to take some responsibility, even for the Salem witch trials, even for the Inquisition, even for the Crusades, then I maintain that the ordinary, mild-mannered atheist at the Tufts Free Thought Society has to take some responsibility for Pol Pot and for Stalin. These guys were committing their crimes in the name of it. You can't just say, well, they sort of resembled religion. Now you're basically saying religion must take the blame not only for what's done in its name, but also for what's done in the name of atheism. This is a totally bogus form of reasoning. So, let me turn, so if the Christians have to take responsibility for Torquemada, poor Dan's going to have to take some responsibility for Stalin. That's just the way it is based on his principle. Now, let's talk about the Big Bang. Very briefly. I don't want to get into a debate about physics. I just want to say something very simple. All of nature came into existence at a certain singularity. Before that, one may say there was no nature, so there can't be a natural explanation for the Big Bang, because the Big Bang encompasses all of nature. So here's my argument. It's very simple. Everything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe has a beginning. The universe has a cause. That cause we call God. That's my argument. Now, fine-tuning. Here is where we get into what I want to call faith-based atheism. Because we have the fact of a universe. And by the way, Dan, I think, very cunningly tried to shift the argument, which is not an argument I made. I did not say that out of the millions of stars in our universe, it's very surprising that we have life on Earth. That can be easily explained. I never made that argument. My argument is that the entire universe, with all its galaxies and all its stars, has to be exactly as old as it is. The mass of the proton has got to be 1900 or 1836 times the mass of the electron, and slightly less heavy than the neutron. My point is the gravitational force, not just here, everywhere, has to be what it is for the universe and life to exist. That's the argument, so answer that one. Well, Dan backed up and tried to answer. You go, well, maybe, and this is a really big maybe, there are lots of other universes. And in fact, there are some cosmologists who say, well, maybe there are an infinite number of universes. And if there are an infinite number of universes, then our universe, however improbable, would in fact, at some point in the great cosmic rolling of the dice, at some point come up. This is what I would call, you may say in some version, the OJ cosmological argument. The DNA evidence points to me, all the other evidence points to me, but that's only in this universe. Maybe there are many other universes in which you, individual jurors, have killed your wives under new DNA evidence and under new laws. So why would you prosecute me in this provincial universe just because I did what I did in this local planet? Now look, I'm not saying that this is even untrue. I don't even mean to be making fun of it. What I'm really saying is it takes a lot of faith to believe it. Because what is the evidence for these other universes? Dan in his book actually cites this man, Lee Smolin, and his astronomical work. I just want to read you a line or two from Smolin. He says, what I'm presenting in this book is frank speculation, if you will, a fantasy. And then, later in the book, I must warn the reader that the ideas I've been describing, there is every chance they will not succeed. He admits in the book very easily, he is essentially engaging, he doesn't like the idea of God. He says that the fine-tuning of the universe seems to point to a supernatural creator, but we can't possibly go there because we're scientists and we have to look for a natural explanation. So he goes, this is the best stuff I can come up with. Now, okay, fair enough, but how about some humility on the other side? How about admitting that there is a lot about our universe that does seem to suggest that just as a car requires a car maker, and just as a painting requires a painter, the laws of nature do require some ultimate explanation. And that's all I'm saying. It opens up the possibility of a divine explanation. Thank you.
Okay, well, let's okay, here we go. The laws of nature require explanation. Well, at any one point, we explain the laws we've got maybe with some other laws, and so it goes. And at any one point, we have laws that we can't explain. That's certainly true. And by the way, the sort of caricature of laws as if they were the kind of laws that, you know, there's penalties for violating. That's not what scientists have ever meant by laws of nature. And anybody who thinks that that's a legitimate criticism has simply misunderstood the nature of the sort of generalization that a physical law is supposed to be. Smolin presents some speculations. He says, here's one thing it could be. I cite them as speculations and say, here's an idea. I don't endorse it. I say, here's an interesting set of scientific ideas. It's nice because it's actually testable. And there are others. There's actually an embarrassment of riches. There's lots of ideas for what it could possibly be that could explain the fine-tuning, that could possibly explain the fine-tuning of this universe. That's all the cosmologists and all the physicists are doing at this point, is responding to what otherwise looks very appealing, and that is, what could it possibly be but an intelligent creator? The answer is, oh, there's lots of things it could possibly be but an intelligent creator. So we'll just call that a draw, maybe. Maybe this is where your agnosticism can join mine, and we say, well, we really don't know what could or would explain the laws of nature, but we don't need to invoke an intelligent creator to explain it. And in fact, the trouble with an intelligent creator is that it seems to get the wrong end of the stick, because we need to explain, where did that intelligent creator come from? Isn't that even more marvelous than the fact that there might be even an infinity of universes, all with slightly different generalizations in them? That idea seems to me at least less extravagant than the idea of a self-creating, eternal, omnipotent, intelligent creator. Let's see. I'll say a bit more about Stalin and atheism then. Yes, I think that we all have to recognize that any powerful idea can be misused, can be abused, and can lead to great harm. And I'm sure that some atheists have made the mistake of what we might call Dostoevsky's mistake, and that is, if God is dead, everything is permitted. Now, that does not follow at all. That is a myth that has done a tremendous amount of damage in the world, and any atheists who think that an implication of their atheism is that there's no difference between right and wrong, that there's no room for morality, I think it has made a very serious mistake. It's a mistake which is very easily made because so many religious people insist on this principle as well. They seem to think that without God, there can't be any goodness, there can't be any morality. This is belied, I think, by everything we know. And notice, finally, that even if it were true that we needed God to tell us what's right and wrong, God doesn't tell us, only God's self-appointed representatives on earth tell us. So in other words, we're going to have to tell each other anyway. Human beings can figure out what is reasonable, what is rational, and what is moral. Human society has evolved to the point where we can sit down and reason, and of our own free will arrive at the best principles to govern our lives by our own lights after open, free, reasonable discussion, fact-based discussion. That's the basis of morality. It's always been the basis of morality. If you look at the morality in the Old Testament, compare it to the morality today, you'll find that it has changed a great deal, and it has changed because people's ideas about what makes sense, what's right and wrong, have evolved. They've grown up. And it's not because God told them something different today than told them before. It's they just figured out that they could no longer tolerate the interpretations of what God was supposedly telling them morality was, that used to pass muster. So we're stuck telling each other as best we can how to live our lives and what makes sense morally. And if it helps you to adorn that process with an imagined deity that speaks to you, that's a psychological fact about you, but it plays no role in the discussion.
I've been trying to listen hard in this debate because I don't want this to be a mudslinging cartoon debate, but one in which we really try to engage issues. And so rather than rebut, I'm going to try to seriously engage some points that have been raised here. I agree, by the way, that morality is not in any way the special province of religious people. I completely agree with that. I think morality is a universal phenomenon, but I think it is a universal phenomenon that cannot be given the easy explanation that Dan gives. We evolved. Wait a minute. Does any biologist believe that we have in a serious way evolved over the last 5,000 years? No. Biologically, we have not evolved. Culturally, morally, socially, institutionally, we're different. Biologically, we're very much the same as Homo sapiens was 5,000. So the word evolution now has been transmuted from a biological meaning, and it's been put on a moral high horse. I want to suggest something different. No, human beings are not in some fundamental natural way better now. In fact, our weapons of mass destruction in some ways have given us a vehicle to be far worse. Yes, it is true that we have representative democracy, and we have the abolition of slavery, and we have the equal dignity of women, and we have the compassion as a social virtue. And you know why we have those things? Not because human beings have evolved. It's because you're living in a Western civilization shaped primarily by Christian assumptions. How do you know this? Look at an example. If there's a famine tomorrow in Rwanda, you can be fairly sure that all the European countries will rush to help, send bags of food, send volunteers, Doctors Without Borders, and so on. Now, there are other rich countries in the world. They will observe, but do nothing. And why? Because they were raised with the belief I was kind of raised with as a kid, which is an Indian proverb, the tears of strangers are mostly water. Which is to say, to some degree, you look out for your own, by the way, a sound Darwinian principle, but you don't necessarily have any common ground with strangers who don't share anything with you. So the point here is, even the European countries that are secular will act in a Christian way. And why? For the reason given by Nietzsche. You can kill God, but you still, at least for a time, have a Christian civilization formed on Christian assumptions. It was those same assumptions that produced the only anti-slavery movement the world has ever known. It was the Quakers and the evangelical Christians who said we are created equal in the eyes of God, and therefore no man has the right to rule another without consent. All right. I want to now say a word about, well, just a word about toxic religion. because that was really the main thrust of Dan's opening presentation. We need to have this education because young people need to learn about toxic religion. And all I'm trying to argue, and I haven't seen it really contested, is that religion is greatly blamed for things, even today, that have very little to do with religion. Oh, but what about the Israelis and the Palestinians? Oh, what about the Shia and the Sunni? What about Northern Ireland? What about in the Balkans? What about the Hindus and the Muslims in Kashmir? Okay, what about those people? Why are the Israelis and the Palestinians fighting? Are they fighting about religion? Are the Israelis saying Moses was the greater prophet? And the Palestinians, no, it was Muhammad who was the greater prophet. No, they are fighting over land. Why are the Hindus and Muslims fighting? They are fighting over Kashmir. In Northern Ireland, they were not fighting about transubstantiation or the Eucharist. They're fighting over which group gets to rule that country. They're fighting about self-determination. So I'm suggesting that one of the problems in this debate, I'm not saying that Dan is incompetent in his field. He's extremely competent. But I'm saying that in this new atheism, we have all these guys from Dawkins to Dan to others who are wandering far outside their fields where they know very little and making authoritative pronouncements about theology, about history, about Christianity. Christopher Hitchens in about 3 lines disposes of Anselm. Sam Harris, biology major, takes on Aquinas in a paragraph. I mean, this is intellectually embarrassing. And I think what it reflects is ultimately an atheist bigotry that is really not willing to take religion seriously. So my goal in this debate has not been ultimately to make the proof for the existence. I said I'm not proving anything. But I am saying that I want to suggest to you that there are serious arguments deriving from history, philosophy, and science that make the case that we should take seriously what most people from most of human history have taken seriously, and even now. So ultimately, this provincial, you may say, northeastern atheism of the academy that snickers at the whole world as being a bunch of idiots, I mean, is this the kind of elitism you want to have in the university where you don't take seriously the way other people experience the world? I mean, consider religion. Let me give you an analogy and I'll close on that. Let's say, for example, I was accused of a crime. I'm accused of killing somebody. I know I didn't do it. I come into court and Dan produces 5 pieces of evidence that say, here is the external evidence that you did it. Now, am I supposed to agree with that evidence, even though I know I didn't do it? In other words, my inward experience is of innocence. The external evidence as laid out is in front of me. All I'm saying is religious people experience the world and experience God as very real in their lives. It's no answer to them to say, well, we can find a guy who saw a UFO. Well, you produce 2/3 of people on the planet who see UFOs on a daily basis since the beginning of time, and I'll take those people seriously. So I'm suggesting that academically, we shouldn't think ourselves superior to everyone else. If you approached any other subject like race relations, imagine if I started making jokes and producing little quips about slaves with funny names and so on, you'd be appalled. And if I said that should be required teaching in the curriculum, after all, people have had very interesting attitudes toward race relations over the centuries. This is not intellectually serious. So to answer Dan's question, I agree with the spirit of his proposal. I just don't want him to be the guy doing it. Thank you.
Well, we will begin our question and answer session. Is there an extra mic for the members of the audience? The other one was intended for that. Those of you who have questions for either or both of our debaters, please come up to one of the aisles and a microphone will be made available. And once again, please ask a question and make it brief. Thank you.
Oh,
Yes.
hi. Hi. I would like to ask Dinesh a question about Occam's razor. You mentioned that the Darwinian concept of Occam's razor is less simpler than the creator and creator argument. But isn't that kind of a circular argument? What if there was a creator, then who created the creator, and who created the creator that created the creator, and so on and so forth?
The question is about if we have a creation and we can posit a creator, who made that guy? And that's a good question. I want to answer it this way. I want to begin with a short analogy, if I may. Think of the universe as a novel. In other words, think of the universe as structured in terms of plot, narrative, characters, and so on. I want to suggest that what religious people are saying is that this novel doesn't explain itself. The novel had an author, a creator. Now, the creator is the creator of the novel at a little bit of a different level of causation than the causation within the novel. So, for example, if you're reading Crime and Punishment, you may say, oh, this guy Raskolnikov, he did this. Well, why did he do that? What accounts for him? That's a sensible question. It would be like asking, what's causing, for example, gravity, or what's causing planets to come together? These are questions of causation within the universe. Now, I want to suggest that Dostoevsky is the creator of the novel at a different level. So the questions that apply to within the causation of the novel don't apply to the external cause of it. You can't say, well, this guy Dostoevsky, what explains him? Where does he come from? He's not internal to the narrative. That's the point I'm trying to get. So if all of nature had a beginning, it has to have a non-natural, and that is all that religious people mean by the word supernatural, cause. Now, that supernatural cause doesn't apply the laws of physics. And why? Because scientists will tell you that the laws of physics are internal to our universe. Just as language requires grammar, and you can't have language, you can't have grammar without language, right? Grammar is the rules for how language internally interacts. The laws of physics are the rules for how our universe interacts. So the laws of physics, I'm just finishing my point, don't apply, you may say, outside of the singularity. If God created the universe, and I'll put an if before it, he didn't use any of the existing laws of physics to do it. That's my point.
To follow up on that,
Dinesh, the trouble with that argument is that you basically contradict yourself. You say, you use the word created, which is in effect a word from the novel, and you claim to give it meaning. Well, if it doesn't mean what it means in the novel, then we don't know what it means. And so your insistence that, well, look, if it has a beginning, something has to create it. That's, you're helping yourself to the regularities within the world, within the natural world, and then you're saying, oh, but they don't apply outside the natural world. Well, if they don't apply outside the natural world, then you have no right to talk about creation at all, because that's something that we know of from the natural world.
Forgive me if I don't articulate this very clearly, but as far as I understand it, Pascal's wager is basically you're betting on if you don't believe in God, then you might be screwing yourself over in the afterlife, because then you'll be divided from him. And the thing I take issue with, or that I find kind of makes the whole argument fallacious, is it doesn't allow for the possibility that a non-believer could in fact be intimate with the divine in the afterlife. It assumes the kind of Abrahamic premise that disbelief is in some fashion offensive to the divine, and therefore divides you from him or it in the afterlife. And basically what I'm saying is, if we then say, okay, it is possible that a non-believer could find intimacy with the divine in the afterlife, then Pascal's wager is reduced to, well, it's still a really good bet because a lot of people believe in these kind of Judeo-Christian idea of reward and punishment based on faith. But then where do you draw the line? Because then I could come up with a rule today that said I feel really strongly that if you don't do 10 push-ups a day, you're going to hell. And it's it's a good bet, because if you go ahead and do the 10 push-ups, then you're all set. But if you don't do them, you're risking going to hell. So I'm just saying, where do you draw the line in terms of absurdity? I mean, is it a more valid risk because so many people believe in this reward-punishment scheme?
Well, I think the power of Pascal's wager is the following, and that is that it, well, two things. One is it exposes the great weakness of the agnostic position. Because the agnostic usually fashions himself or herself a morally superior person who stays in this sort of suspended doubt awaiting evidence. And what Pascal is saying is that, listen, no, this is not a reasonable position, not only, by the way, because of the afterlife, but because the afterlife makes a lot of difference in how you live now. I mean, imagine if someone were to say to you, instead of living for 80 years, you're going to live for 500 years. You probably would live somewhat differently. Or that, like the recent movie with Queen Latifah, where you know you have only 7 more days to live. You would live differently. We would all live differently if we believed in eternal life. So the point that Pascal is making is you have to take the idea seriously, not just for then, but also for now. It's going to affect how you live now. Okay? So agnosticism becomes a sort of willful refusal to take a stance when it makes a lot of difference what you decide. See, one of the problems with saying I'll only stick with scientific issues and only go with the scientific evidence is that science, while sovereign in its own sphere, doesn't affect large spheres of life, including love, including consciousness, including will. I'm not saying science has nothing to say about it, but just read Steven Pinker's How the Mind Works. Science hasn't gotten very far in explaining sentience, morality. Not that the evolutionists haven't tried. They've tried really hard. And I'll say a word later maybe about evolution and morality. But what Pascal is basically saying is, in much of life, many of the decisions you make, you graduate from Tufts, you have a choice. Do I become a poet or I go to law school? That choice may affect everything that subsequently happens to you. It may affect who you marry, where you go to graduate school, or whether you go at all, whether you end up in politics or a partner in a law firm. And you have no information. You can never get full information, and yet you have to choose. And the same is true of God as well. That's the argument.
Yeah, I'm sorry for reading this, but I tried to put this all together, and it's too bizarre to remember. So I believe this is for Dr. D'Souza. I believe you call yourself a Christian, and so for the sake of argument, let's accept your argument that there is a creator of the universe, and that creator is omniscient. What would make you go from that to that he's like also a loving God, and he created us in his perfect image, but then we turned out to be imperfect, so he decided to cast us down to burn hell, but then he didn't feel so good about that, so the only loophole he could come up with, the creator of the universe, was to immaculately conceive a human child and have him tortured and killed, and we're still imperfect, but that's okay if we suck up to him and the child, and he doesn't want us to be gay, and so on.
Okay, let me try to answer kind of in the spirit. And that's this. Look, if you are trying to understand a phenomenon, whether you agree with it or not, you begin by understanding it by trying to understand it as the believer or the practitioner understands it themselves. If I was trying to understand Dostoevsky or take Hamlet, I wouldn't go, well, this is absolutely ridiculous. Witches appearing and so on. It's absurd. I throw the novel down right away. I'm not going to read it. It's absurd. No, I suspend my disbelief. I say, let me try to experience Hamlet in the way Shakespeare wanted it experienced. And then once I've finished, once I've evaluated critically, I can step back and go, well, that didn't make much sense, and that didn't really follow from that, and why is Hamlet so indecisive, and so on. Okay, here's what I want to get at. Let me give you, if I may, in 1 minute, the Christian reformulation of your statement of the human problem. The Christian formulation is this, and that is, quite apart from religion, we have a human problem. Namely, we live at 2 levels. We live here, and we want to be here. In other words, we want to be good, but we realize we fall short. We want to experience the divine, but God is invisible. He's not real to us on a daily basis. We feel the awful silence, you may say, speak from outside. So here we are as human beings who are at this level. We want to ultimately experience the sublime. True? I think all human beings are that way. And that's why we have not just religion, we have art, we have literature, we have love, ways of experiencing the sublime. Now, the different religions of the world all diagnose the human problem that way. And I see the Eastern religions as having one solution. The problem is the self. Get rid of the self. I see the Judaism and Islam as having a common solution, which is basically, let's establish a set of rules and codes to bridge the gap between, you may say, man down here and God up here. And this involves dietary regulations and sacrifices and commandments and so on. And Christianity comes along and gives a totally different answer to that question. Namely, look, the distance between the humans and the divine is so large that no matter how tall a ladder you build, you're not going to get there. Basically, the only way for man to reach God is for God to come down to man's level. And I'm stating this in very secular terms. So the incarnation is seen not as just some bloody sacrifice. I mean, most Christians would emphasize not the crucifixion, but the resurrection. The idea here is that in the ancient world, you had a lot of blood. Look at all the blood the Aztecs spilled. Look at all the blood sacrifices in the ancient world. Basically, Christianity comes along, and the basic argument is God sacrifices his son. And that's the end of all the blood sacrifice. No more need to kill goats. No more need to take people and slap them on the altars and chop their heads off. And this was widespread in the ancient world in pagan cultures. And these blood sacrifices, I would argue, have been revived in modern paganism and modern atheism. This idea that blood itself is a source of power. Just read the rhetoric of the Nazis. There's a lot of talk about blood. Volk, blood. This idea of purifying blood is a revival of ancient animism, and I would argue ancient paganism, but given as secular guise. I mean, Hitler, for example, spent a lot of time talking about the Nordic legends, a lot of time talking about the ancient gods. The only difference was he didn't believe in them. He was trying to give them a secular reinterpretation. All right, I'm going on and on. But what I'm getting at here is simply that the Christian experience is very different than your, I think, caricature of it. So if we're going to get away from cartoon belief, I'd like to see my belief. I don't mind having them criticized, but I'd like to see them criticized in the way that I articulate them and defend them.
Well, is there a question for Professor Dennett? Thank you. I sort of have what is sort of, I think, a logical... Is it on? Okay. I sort of what I would think is a logical follow-up to the last question. And my question is tying it also to the idea of Pascal's wager. So Pascal's wager, as I see it, as you've proposed it, is predicated on the idea that there are two options. There's closeness to God and or disbelief and belief. My question, though, is when you have Christians who tell me that the only way to heaven is through belief in Jesus Christ, and you have Muslims telling me that the only way is through a set of beliefs in Muhammad, and Jews or Buddhists or any other belief telling me their belief is the only valid belief structure, don't you have to at least reevaluate Pascal's wager to the point where the logical option is at least agnosticism and at most atheism? Yeah.
I put the point even more strongly. If we're talking about rationality, why don't you bet on all of them at once? If it's really, if one wager is good, we'll go for all of them, and that way you got all your bases covered.
Well, that's not rational because these religions do make some mutually exclusive claims. But I would say quite seriously that if you're taking your point seriously and following it, the conclusion is not. I mean, look, let's look by analogy. We conduct a survey of all the world's cultures, okay, tomorrow, and I ask them only scientific questions. What do you think about Kepler's laws? What do you think about evolution? What do you think about Einstein? I submit to you, we will get a wide range of answers. Many people may say, well, you know, I've listened to the arguments. I'm going to go with Ptolemy on that one. Well, I've listened to all this. I think old Einstein was basically joking. So you might get the vast majority of the world's people go thumbs down on Darwin, thumbs down on Einstein. But you don't go from that. Well, you know what? The disagreement of all these different cultures clearly convinces me that there's no true answer. I will be an atheist and agnostic on these issues from now on. You would see that as a total non sequitur. Why? Because you believe that there is a right answer and it's your job to find out what it is. So if you follow your premise seriously, yes, the religions of the world have certain common elements, common morality. Many of them today, at least, posit a monotheistic creator. And I would say it's your job to go find out which one is making true claims. Spend some time and take it seriously, and then decide what you think is the right way to go. I'm not asking you to go any other way than what you think is right, but to just in a facile way go, there's 10 of them, and they can't all be right, so I'll choose none of the above. That's not a very rational solution.
Another question for you. I'm sorry that all the questions are going to you. Personally, I'm a little bit worried by almost the ease of God as a response. God is almost defined, or God is generally defined as outside the human sphere of consciousness. God is invisible. God is not in one particular place. If we search the entire universe, we could not possibly find God. I feel like this definition of God as completely outside the human realm of testing is a simplification, or not a simplification, but too easy of an answer.
Well, do you mind if I ask you a question or two in response? Okay. You experience an external world, right?
Yes.
But the external world you experience is experienced through the lenses of your 5 senses.
Yes.
Can you give me an independent proof that the rest of us could accept that your experience of the external world actually corresponds with the external world out there? Can you prove that?
I probably could not.
Okay. You accept the existence of other people, other minds, other souls, other people out there, right? You believe that there are other people in the world. You're not the only guy on the earth, right?
Right.
Okay. Do you think you can give independent demonstration that doesn't rely on your own subjective consciousness at all, since we can't see that other minds actually exist?
I think it's going to depend on my subjective consciousness.
Exactly. All right. So there are large spheres of human experience, consciousness, love, morality, that rely on the subjective dimension of human experience that can never be produced under a microscope and under a telescope, and yet you couldn't live 1 second or 1 day without them. Your whole, in fact, far from matter creating mind, isn't it true that the entire experience, our entire experience of the world comes through our consciousness, which is an irreducible starting point of all experience. Without that consciousness, we have no window into external reality at all. True?
True.
Okay. And yet, all of that you take for granted as having an independent existence. You go through life perfectly willing to accept consciousness, reality, other people. But somehow when it comes to God, your standards change completely. Suddenly you go, oh, gee, I've sent people into outer space. I haven't seen any big man with a beard out there handing out stuff. So how can I really believe in that guy? That's all I'm saying to think about.
I think the slip in what you just said is in saying that consciousness is irreducible. Consciousness is where each one of us starts, of course, with our own experience. But then, thanks to our developed scientific worldview, we can pool the experiences of others. Of course, we need our own experience to do that. And then we can turn that tool back on ourselves, and we can study our own subjectivity. We can study our own consciousness. We can have theories of human consciousness. We can understand what makes us tick. And there's nothing irreducible about it. We are on the, of all things to say, at this point in the 21st century, when we are making such tremendous progress in understanding the machinery, if you like, of consciousness, that strikes me as just preposterous.
Yeah, okay. My question is about intelligent design and evolution. Where do you stand, each of you, on the issue? Was God a product of intelligent design, or did he evolve?
Was God a product of intelligent design? No, yeah. Okay. Well, I think some concepts of God are a product of human design. I think that is some conceptions of God are very clearly contrived by individual human contrivers. Some religions, I mean, Scientology is a religion. It's entirely the result of human, deliberate design. Whereas other religions, like Christianity, say, and more generally, is itself a product not of intelligent design, but of evolved design, culturally evolved design, where most of the design moves, most of the R&D was unwittingly done by humans passing on their traditions in the same way that languages are unwittingly designed. So I think that the concept of God is indeed a product of that sort of process, in the same way that the harmonic scale is a product of that sort of process. As far as the intelligent design movement in America, that's just a hoax.
Next question. Yeah.
Well, let's put it this way. Einstein's laws are the product of intelligent design, but it in no way follows from that they don't describe a reality and a reality independent of those laws. So you're committing a genetic fallacy in saying that because human beings have conceived of the idea of God, therefore it's a made-up idea. It doesn't follow at all. Human beings could well have conceived of it, and it could well be describing an independent reality. Now, I don't agree with intelligent design in the way that it's mostly understood as basically a way of fighting with Darwin. Did the eye evolve, and did the dog and the wolf have a common ancestor, and so on. That's not my argument. My argument is that the validity of the intelligent design argument is completely valid when applied to the universe as a whole. And here's a very brief analogy to illustrate that. If you and I were walking on the street and we saw a car, an automobile, we know immediately that it's the product of intelligent design, right? The molecules didn't fly up and all assemble themselves into a car. So that's the universe. Now along comes Dan Dennett, who says, wait a minute, I want to show you the wheels of this car. These are the different life forms. And I want to show you that one life form, in other words, the life forms can be produced without external intervention. They operate according to natural forces that are within the car, meaning within the universe. I would argue, so? The evolution of the part in no way refutes the intelligent design of the whole. So if the universe as a whole requires explanation, Dan says it doesn't need explanation. Even David Hume, the great skeptic, says we can never say anything so ridiculous as to posit an effect without a cause. So the universe, I would submit, with all its laws, does require some ultimate explanation. We would be really ignoramuses if we just said, well, it's just there. Imagine if you use that explanation for other things. The crater, it's just there. The dead actress who's been found in Hollywood, the head just appeared. No one really did it. No detective work is necessary. It doesn't need a cause. Well, it does need a cause, and if you're going to posit a cause, the most reasonable cause is to posit an intelligent designer that made it that way.
Hi, this question's for Professor D'Souza. You maintain that the Big Bang must have had a cause, as you've been going on and on. However, this, in effect, created the universe that is grounded in such rules of cause and effect. Yet, at the same time, you also maintain that as humans, we are creatures of free will and choice, and therefore are exempt from this universal canon of cause and effect. Does this not strike you as a gross inconsistency at best?
On the contrary, it is completely consistent with my supposition, let's call it a hypothesis, that a discretionary God who did not have to make the universe was not created out of necessity. It was created out of free, at least this is the Christian view, out of free will. We are created in the image of God, which means that to some degree we have some resemblance to God. In what way? What resemblance? Well, God's not a material thing. There's no Christian tradition going back to the beginning that holds God to be God's spiritual. So we don't resemble God in our material frame. That's why I have no problem with the theory of evolution, because I think that the material frame of man can be adequately explained by evolution. But I maintain that man also has a moral and a spiritual dimension. And while evolution has made pretty good headway in explaining what could be called low altruism, I scratch your back, you scratch my back, or the mother jumps in the burning car because, wait a minute, her children happen to share her genes, that's why she's doing it, disguised selfishness. This is all very clever, but frankly, it doesn't go very far. It accounts for about 10% of morality. If you get up and give your seat in a bus to a stranger, you know, Richard Dawkins may come and go, well, that was a very cunning move. You're hoping the old lady will give you her seat next week. No, you're just doing it because you're a nice guy. Or you give blood, or Mother Teresa, or give me liberty or give me death. There are lots of people who do things for strangers where they have no even disguised benefit. And I think evolution has not actually given a very plausible, it's given some implausible accounts of this, but it hasn't really accounted for morality, and I think it's that many people would admit that.
We're going to go till about 9:15, but in this segment, we're going to have each of the debaters respond for a maximum of 1 minute.
Dinesh, the 10% that you think is explained, you're just not looking at the 90% of the rest of the work. You're offering caricatures of the work that's actually being done on the evolution of morality. And, you know, I've written quite a bit about this, and you can read my books and find there much more interesting, much more compelling, and more persuasive facts. It isn't all just you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. It's not all just looking out for your genes. The work that's being done does promise to provide a complete account of the genesis of morality. That does not, however, provide an account of why, you know, which aspects of this we endorse. That is not a job for science. That's a job for a political discussion.
Thank you.
We've heard a lot tonight about the crimes of other messianic ideologies such as Nazism or communism, but I'd like to hear what both of the speakers think of Scandinavia, which happens to have 70% atheists or agnostics and happens to have the highest human development in the world. And why would we be opposed to acknowledge that, yeah, we had a Christian tradition, but we move beyond that and we take care of our own. They give the most to charity. They have the lowest crime rates. I mean, you could go on how they outperform America on just about everything, and they're agnostic and atheist.
I'm glad you raised that point. When I planted my hayfield some years back, my neighbor said, "Well, you want to plant oats as a nurse crop." I said, "What's a nurse crop?" He said, "Well, it comes up first and it protects the Timothy, the hay. Then once the hay gets a good start, it protects it against weeds and against insects and so forth. Then you can cut the oats. You can harvest it as you want, but it's something that comes up first and provides a scaffolding and a protection." And I think of religion as a sort of nurse crop. I think that Dinesh is probably right that much of what we value in secular 21st century America has its roots in Christian, for instance, traditions that helped to foster attitudes which led to the scientific revolutions of the 17th and later centuries that led to our principles of democracy and freedom and so forth. And I think we can be very grateful for the religious contributions to that. But now I think it's time for us to grow up. I think we've outgrown the need for this nurse crop, and we can carry on in a secular country. And I think the Scandinavian countries are a perfect example of that.
I'm actually going to go back and read Dan's books because I do want to learn more about the evolutionary arguments about morality, and I hope to learn from them as I've learned from your other books as well. I do want to urge you to do something as well, and that is to take seriously an argument that was made by the philosopher Nietzsche. Now, Nietzsche is perhaps the great atheist thinker of the last 100 years. and he argued as follows. He said there are many people in the West who want to have it both ways. They want to kill God, but they want to keep Christian morality. In other words, Christianity brought in things into the world that weren't there before, and Nietzsche, as an expert on ancient Greece and Rome, knew this. There was very little value in human life in ancient Greece and Rome. And the Spartans notoriously left the sick child on the hillside to die in the cold. So the preciousness of every human life, that's a Christian idea. Nietzsche knew that, but he didn't like the idea. The equality of men and women, or the equality of the races, another Christian idea. Again, Nietzsche had serious reservations about it. He thought that woman, for example, was inferior to man, and he has some of the most misogynistic statements in Western literature. So here's Nietzsche's point. Nietzsche's point is many people think you can kill God, but keep all those nice things that came into the world because of the Christian God. Nietzsche says that's an illusion. If you kill God, all those other things go too. And he predicted the 20th century would be a century of great wars, great conflicts, the fraying of the value of human life along the edges, both at the beginning, abortion, and at the end, infanticide, euthanasia. He said these ideas will all make a comeback. He was for it, but he was also prophetic. We have been seeing that happen. So I would just suggest that if you like equality, you like human dignity, you like compassion, be a little careful before pompously announcing, oh yeah, we'll cut off the roots and keep the branches and so on. That doesn't really work in nature, and Nietzsche argues it doesn't really work in civilization either.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm sorry I have to pick on Christianity, but unfortunately, and I think it is unfortunate, the structure of this debate was in such a way that the advocate for God was a Christian. Anyways, my question is what sort of reasoning you can give for, or reasoning you can give for believing in or knowing that Jesus Christ, and I'm assuming that without Jesus Christ, Christianity doesn't hold without him. How can you justify that he's any different than John Fromm, which was a point that Dennett was making? And then to Dennett, my question would be, couldn't you just make the case that the belief in goodness, which you were talking about, is exactly God?
We have to be very, very brief.
Yeah, I think that goodness is what we need to believe in, and what we need to thank, and what we want to add to. And if God is as mysterious as many who believe in God say, then maybe God just turns out to be the human goodness that we have around us. It's super, and it's natural. It's just not supernatural.
Okay. Yeah. We're going to go to the next question, because we have to move on. Thank you.
My question is for the professor, and it has to do with the ethics of debate, and by that I mean the integrity that each debater brings to the debating table. At the heart of your case, you have charged Mr. D'Souza repeatedly with engaging in cartooning of your ideas, by which I understand you to mean that he diminishes the substance of your ideas so as to the more readily destroy them. My question to you is, when you then when you elevate Stalin to the status of a god, have you then done exactly the very same thing that you charge him with? And in so doing, in the process of elevating him to the status of a god, is that a reflection of that growth and maturity that you advocated a moment ago for humanity?
Maybe you misunderstood my point about Stalin. Stalin took himself and advertised himself to be, in effect, a god, and built up around himself a pseudo-religious, quasi-religious, proto-religious set of institutions. And that was my point. I don't see that I was caricaturing anything that D'Souza said. No, but there are many gods that are not the God of which he speaks. He didn't speak about Thor or Odin either, or for that matter, John Frum.
Thank you. Next question.
This question is for Dinesh. Earlier in your argument, you largely ridiculed both Daniel Dennett and most atheists as the caveman who stands at the end of his 2-kilometer territory and says, well, since I can't see anything else out there, it must not be there. And you stated that this was actually an impediment to human thought, or would be an impediment to human thoughts. But by stating that God is something that you can never truly understand and is outside your own experience, and therefore you can never truly understand creation or how the human mind really works, aren't you then the caveman that stands at the end of your territory and says, well, as I can't understand what made all that out there, I guess I'll never be able to understand it and I shouldn't even explore it. And isn't that just as much of a hindrance to human, the forwarding of the human race?
Let's explore this more closely. Do you mind if I ask you a question or two back? And just would you agree that if we were to, for example, ask a dog, even if we had a way to communicate with it, to explain Newton's laws, would a dog be capable of doing that?
Communicate then maybe, but not right now.
So you think the failure of the dog is merely one of articulation,
No, I think
not comprehension?
Isn't a creature that's capable of that kind of understanding, that level of understanding?
Exactly. All right. And you would agree that this is true of really every other creature, that in other words, there are limits to its ability to understand. Now, do you think that man, of all creatures, is exempt from all creation in that, to our knowledge, there is absolutely no limit whatsoever? Omniscience is available to us.
But shouldn't we be trying?
I'm not asking whether as an operational principle we should be trying. That's like saying that if I want to be Michael Jordan, should I keep jumping and trying to hit the net? Maybe I should. But my point is, if I said to myself, can I be Michael Jordan, modesty and humility and a recognition of my own impediments, including a bad hip, force me to truthfully say, I don't think I could. All I'm trying to get you to admit is, as human beings, there actually are some limits to what we can know. I'll state one. All the knowledge that we get is experienced through our senses, right? Do you know of any knowledge we can experience any other way? So our senses are like a 5-node tape recorder that are limited in comprehending experience, and no experience unavailable through those can be gained by us, ever. True?
Except for our ability to reason outside of our 5 senses.
But even then, the data comes from the 5 senses.
I suppose, yes.
Okay, so right there we've established a finite limit to human knowledge. Even though we can learn more and more, we will never be able to get beyond our 5 senses as long as we are human. We might have telescopes, but we still have to look at them through our eyes. We might have infrared, but we still have to look at that and measure it through our senses. That's my point, that as human beings, we should not be so hubristic. Of course we should try. I'm not calling for a ban on human knowledge. I'm simply saying that a recognition of our own limits, and this is Kant's point in the Critique of Pure Reason, reason should investigate its own parameters before declaring itself omniscient. We should do that.
My question is for Mr. Dennett, and it's relatively simple, and you can take this as you will. I'm just curious to hear your response. What, sir, if you are wrong? What if you're wrong?
I just wish that every religious person would ask that question too. I think that scientists and academicians take very seriously the question, what if I'm wrong? And I've devoted a great deal of thought to that in my own life and to my own work. And I look around me and I see religious people who are positively discouraged from asking that. They are told, don't even think about that. Trust your faith and don't ask that question. And I think that is the height of arrogance on the part of the religious community, not the scientific community. We ask ourselves, what if I'm wrong?
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, I have a question for Mr. D'Souza, which might provoke a response from Dr. Dennett. We're all reasonable people, and part of that is embracing all of the principles of rationality, including the principle of parsimony, which is if you can't prove something by either induction or support by deduction, that you don't accept it if it's a proposition that says something exists or something happens. So I could claim there's invisible fairies in this room, and the only way they interact with us is by tickling our pineal glands. But if I were to say this to you, you could rightfully ask me, what am I smoking? Unless I can provide evidence. So when it comes to the question of God, where is your evidence, or on what basis can you dismiss the principle of parsimony?
Okay, the principle of parsimony, as you stated, is that either something is true by definition, right, or it's true by empirical verification, right? And if it's not true based on those two things, it's false, correct? We shouldn't accept it. Exactly. So let's apply your principle to the principle of parsimony. Is it true by definition? No. Is it true by empirical verification? No. So let's throw it out.
Mr. D'Souza, you use this image of the rock rolling down the hill, which has to obey physical laws, whereas we, who are intentional beings, our decisions aren't determined by physical laws. Would you accept that neurons and the other aspects of the brain seem to obey material laws? And if so, why do you reject the notion that our minds, thoughts, and decisions could be determined by the same physical forces?
Wow, I'm given 30 seconds. Look, you're raising a very deep question about the way in which material things like neurons and non-material things like thoughts, feelings, and consciousness affect each other. I think you are dogmatically assuming that there is a one-way movement from the material thing to the non-material thing. I assert that I can equally plausibly show that there is a movement in the opposite direction. In medicine, there is something known as the placebo effect. For example, you're sick, you go to see the doctor. Now, your physical condition is already determined, right? You're sick in some way. And yet, if you think you're going to get well, even though you take no medicine, or you just take water, but you think that the water contains medicine, your mind is able to reshape the matter, and you actually feel better. So here is a practical example. By the way, one of the most widely tested examples in all of medicine. It's believed that 20 to 30% of all cures in medicine are due to the placebo effect. Here is a concrete example of mind shaping matter in very much the same way that you assert, dogmatically, that matter shapes mind. I agree with Dan that this is an unsettled matter. There's a lot of research going into it. I want to just deny at the end of this debate that religious people operate in some kind of self-satisfied certainty. I maintain that if you read the Bible, you read the book of Job, you read Christian theologians from Augustine on, so you will realize this is absolutely not so. Yes, there are self-satisfied jerks everywhere. On the other hand, the true Christian tradition is one of humility. It is one of questioning. It is one of being open to truth. I would maintain that that questioning spirit of science is very much not only related to, it is in some way a product of Western Christianity.
I'm going to ask our last two questioners to ask their questions in succession, and then give each speaker a minute, and then we're done.
So my question is, first of all, I don't really believe that there has been equal dignity for women established universally. I think it's more legislative than actually socially or culturally established. But this is for both candidates, as has been said. But why are women almost universally excluded from the hierarchies of religion and decision-making in religions?
Thank you. Ask the next question, please. Yeah.
Yeah, my question is for Mr. D'Souza. One of the things you've been saying a lot is that everything has to have a creator, so like the car has to have a maker, the painting has to have a painter. Well, why is God exempt from that rule? Because if he has a creator, then then we have to ask, like, who's his creator, where did he come from, who created him? But if he doesn't have a creator, then how did he get there?
Thank you.
I'll answer the first one. I think that the reason that women have in general not played those roles does have ultimately a biological explanation in terms of the way in which human cultures have evolved and in the way in which males have moved into positions of power and maintained them over the years. That's a long story, but it's also, I think, not very original. So I think it's a good question, and I think it has an answer if you consider religion as a natural phenomenon, as I do, and there's quite a literature on it. Now, anticipating maybe another filibuster to the left, since this may be my last remark, oddly enough, I'm going to say something that you won't understand, but somebody out there will. Dennett Singer, if you ever hear this, I've lost your address and I would like to reply to you.
Well, let me say this. I apologize if I've overspoken my time. Perhaps the reason most of the questions were aimed at me is that we're speaking in an audience where young people today are more naturally sympathetic to Dennett. In other words, if we were having the same debate in a church, most likely most of the questions would have gone to him. He would have every chance to filibuster. And also he's here at Tufts. You can come talk to him tomorrow. You won't have me here tomorrow. So perhaps that's one reason the questions came to me. I think the one charge I do want to answer at the end here is just briefly this charge of caricature. And I want to say that it's, I went back and I read Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard, one of the world's leading biologists, I think everyone would agree. And Dan's a philosopher, but I think he'd probably concede that Steve knows more about biology than he does. In his review of Dan's book, he says, he calls it a caricature of a caricature. He says that Dawkins has taken evolution and absurdly extended it into all kinds of other areas it doesn't belong. He's using evolution to explain economics, infidelity, laughter, law, literature, music, politics, war, why children don't like vegetables, why men don't like to ask for directions. This is, you can say, evolution run amok. And I think, quite honestly, it is a claiming of the prestige for science, for making metaphysical and political claims that have nothing to do with science. So Gould used the phrase Darwinian fundamentalist. And what he means by this is not that Dan is a religious fundamentalist, but that he is making of evolution what the fundamentalists make of the Bible. The fundamentalists read the Bible, you may say, every human answer is in the Bible. And moreover, the Bible is infallible and it can be extended to everything. This is, you can say, Christianity to run amok or taken in a certain kind of simplistic way. And the argument here is not over evolution, which I agree with, but rather, I think, over the extension of evolution beyond its parameters. It doesn't account for the beginning of life. It doesn't account, or not a full account, of consciousness, and it certainly hasn't given a full account of morality. It is true as far as it goes, but it doesn't go that far. So ultimately, if you want to be an atheist, you can, but don't pretend like you're doing it for scientific reasons. If you want to reject God, that is your right. That is your liberty. But on the other hand, you can't then say, I'm making this choice, but I don't want to live with the consequences of this choice. Ultimately, in Christianity, hell is not a place where God flings the unbeliever. No, ultimately, you say no to God, and God respects your choice. Ultimately, you may say the gates of hell are closed from the inside, which is to say, your rejection is respected as your free choice. I want to thank Dan for sharing the podium with me. I certainly have enjoyed this very much, and I have tried to give it in the right spirit. Thank you for having me.